questions that you will put in the Q&A, and the panel will see these, and our moderator, Richard Bardgett, will pull these out and ask questions. And please don't be discouraged if we don't get to every question. It's just not possible. We usually have quite a few. But as I say, you can then come back and maybe contact other people about this subject. I think the way that this is going to work is, first, I have been neglectful in not thanking Juliet Hoover, who is now in command of our webinar here. She is our tech support and all-time booster at Colorado State University, and then also Dr. Monica Farfan, who also helps to organize this webinar series. We will have one each month going into this academic year. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator. Many of you may know Richard. He's from Manchester University. I'm not going to give a long introduction because you may have seen his name with the webinar. So Richard, welcome.
Yeah, well, good day and evening to everyone, and welcome to this GSBI Speaks webinar on climate change-induced wildfire effects on soil biodiversity. As Diana said, my name is Richard Bardgett. I'm a professor at the University of Manchester, and my role is to moderate this discussion for the next hour and a half. But before we start, the first thing I really would like to do is to introduce our panelists. Diana said we have a broad range of topics to consider and a broad range of panelists with expertise in different areas related to wildfire and their impacts on soils and their diversity. So first, I'd like to introduce Lizzie Wandrag, who's from the University of York. So perhaps if Lizzie could just put the video on very quickly. We also have Konstantin Gongalsky from the Russian Academy of Sciences. We have Marie-Charlotte Nilsson from Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And we have Mac Callaham from the US Forest Service. So welcome and thanks very much to our panelists, and I'll come to them later on. Now, I just wanted to start off with just a few words of introduction really to this general topic and the reasons why the GSBI selected this as a topic for this particular webinar. I think the most important point is that this panel is very timely. COP26 is coming up in Glasgow, which is arguably a make or break opportunity to tackle climate change. But also it falls at a time when we are increasingly hearing about devastating wildfires fueled by things like record-breaking temperatures in different parts of the world, and also extensive and intense droughts. And as many people have argued, the impacts of these wildfires on our lives, on our livelihoods, but also on the environment, including biodiversity and things like carbon cycle feedbacks, demands ambitious climate action now. But one of the things that became clear to me as I looked into this topic, because it's not really a key topic of my expertise, but one thing that came quite clear, and I'm sure our panelists will talk about this more, is that fire risk is very complex. It depends not just on climate and climate change, but on interactions with human activities, things that can start fires, as well as intensify or suppress fire risk, and its impacts on ecosystems. So things like changing the fuel characteristics of a forest or through proactive fire management. Complicating things even further, fire risk depends on things like proximity to urban areas, topography of the land, and also things like pest and disease outbreaks, which can actually increase the fuel loading capacity of an ecosystem through the buildup of dead litter, with obvious implications for the soils. So in other words, fire risk and its impacts on soils and also their biodiversity are likely to be very complex. And I think the other point I think is important to make, and I think our first speaker, Mac, will actually elaborate on this to some extent, is that wildfire is a natural component of the Earth system, and it has been for millennium and centuries. And this needs to be considered when we're discussing climate change-induced impacts on wildfire, on soils and their diversity. Now, when I was looking into this topic, I read an editorial which was in Nature Geosciences recently, and it stated that anthropogenic climate change is exacerbating the impacts of wildfires, but the complexities of wildfire dynamics and their interactions with human activities are such that each region and ecosystem must be studied in its own right. In other words, there is no one-size-fits-all answer for different regions. And that's one of the reasons why we selected people for this panel, or invited people working in very different regions where different impacts of fire and different fire regimes will exist, determining how climate change will impact on their diversity of life in soil. So really that takes us to the panel. That's all I really want to say. As Diana said, we've selected a range of people to discuss their research on this particular topic, and also to consider how soil diversity research in the context of wildfire might inform future land use policy, and potentially also inform discussions at COP. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and our first speaker is Mac Callaham from the US Forest Service. So welcome, Mac, and I'll pass over to you.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Richard, and I'll get my screen sharing going here, and we can just be off. All right, so I've entitled this very brief presentation, Managing Soil Biodiversity on a Burning Planet, Remembering How to Live with Fire. And I hope I can convince the audience and the other panelists that throughout most of Earth's history, in fact, fire has been a really important ecological process, and perhaps even the ecological imperative. So from the advent of plant life colonizing terrestrial habitats on Earth, as soon as they were able to raise atmospheric oxygen levels to 13% where combustion will occur, we've got evidence in the fossil record going back millions of years, in fact. So about 50 million years after plant life adapted to terrestrial habitats, we have evidence of fires, large fires occurring across landscapes. So if we look in the southern, or if we look at the United States in general, that's where I work, and so I'll focus a lot on this part of the North American continent. And we look at vegetation chemistry and production rates. Rich Guyette and his colleagues at University of Missouri came up with this model, which shows that the vegetation can support fire frequencies on the order of, I know this is probably difficult to see, but on the order of less than 2 years. Every year there's enough fuel being produced with the right kind of chemistry for fires to occur every 2 years or every 10 years, with pockets out here in the Western US of about every 40 years. So this is a combustion potential. And so what I want to do now is focus on this area right here in the Southern Appalachian mountain chain, which is very close to where I live and where we do a lot of our work. You can see that this area, based on chemistry, ought to be able to burn, chemistry and climate and moisture conditions ought to be able to burn very frequently. So my colleague Steve Norman at EFATAC, which is the Eastern Forests Environmental Threats Assessment Center, who also works for the Forest Service, put together this data, and you can see the black dots are from 2001 to the present, or 2016 roughly. The red dots are 15 years earlier than that, and the white dots are from 1970 to 1985 or so. So what you look when you see this arrayed across a gradient from dry to wet and from cold to hot, the year 2016 stands out as being the hottest and driest year that we have on record, with the white dots being down here in the cooler and wetter regions. So this is indicative of a warming and drying climate, at least over that time frame. So now let's look at the number of wildfires that occurred over that same time frame. So now the dots have been expanded so that size is relative to the number of fires that actually occurred. We see that 2016 was not really special in terms of the number of fires on federal lands. And again, this is in the Southern Appalachians, and the data are specifically for the October and November, so the autumn timeframe. All right, so we see that 2016 up here in this area was not particularly distinctive in terms of the number of fires, but if we look at the amount of area burned, now 2016 really distinguishes itself. And so the argument that I'm trying to make here is that in a warmer and drier climate, fires are going to occur. They're going to occur at a larger scale than is customary and we really need to know what to do to deal with them. So this is what you get. This is a picture from the Chimney Tops 2 fire, which happened in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the fall of 2016. So the questions that we have that are more or less outstanding is, we understand that these ecosystems ought to burn, and we have evidence from the pollen record that they do burn very frequently, or did burn very frequently prior to human interventions. So we've got decades of fire suppression, and we need to know what that's done to the soil environment. Likewise, what has this fire suppression and other factors done to forest species composition? Are there interactions between fire suppression and species composition changes? Are there effects on soil biota to these interactions? And what happens when we reintroduce fire, particularly in light of climate change? So basically what this shows is that we get a large accumulation of organic matter in the forest floor when fire is suppressed. When wildfires occur, this accumulation of organic matter disappears in wildfires, and the fine roots that have proliferated in there also get consumed when fires occur. So this is an ECM dominated stand. So oaks and hickories, the species we think of as being dominant in forest floor and in the forests of the Southern Appalachians. Whereas when you get a species shift to more AM dominated forest stands, fire effects are much less. So when I'm going to skip this one because I'm running out of time, but when we look at soil invertebrates, this is in paired plots at the Rock Mountain fire, burned and unburned, arrayed across an ECM gradient. What we notice is that the soil invertebrate community is mostly influenced by forest species composition and the season of collection, but we detected no fire effect. So this suggests that these invertebrates are possibly adapted to fires. So the path forward for us now is, in order for us to manage the risks that are associated with wildfires, we need to manage fuels, including O horizon, which is a big part of the soil horizons, right? And so this can be accomplished either through prescribed fires or through overstory species manipulation. We can intentionally introduce plants that don't burn. But we have evidence from 2016 that in a warming and drying climate, fires are inevitable regardless of tree species composition. So we need to come up with a way forward that involves active management of fuels. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that, for Mac. Now what we're going to do is move on to Lizzie Wandrag. So Lizzie, if you could share your screen and we'll pass over to you. Thank you.
That. So yeah, thank you for the invitation to participate in this. It's a really interesting discussion for me. Just recently started working in this area. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, the 2019-2020 fire season in Australia was highly unusual in terms of both the magnitude and the severity of wildfires. So this map here shows the state of New South Wales in Eastern Australia. And you can see that a huge portion of its forest burnt during those fires. Some areas to really high severity. And that corresponds to a situation where the vegetation at the site, including the canopy, is clearly consumed. And the burnt area represents the majority of Eastern Australia's open eucalypt forest. So at the time I was working in northern New South Wales, close to this area you can see here, which is a state conservation area full of rare and endemic plant species. And the whole area, as you can see, burnt to some degree. So colleagues were interested in understanding what the effects of that burn might be on community recovery following this really large fire. And we sort of discussed whether we thought there'd be any role of plant-soil interactions in that recovery. And the answer is that given the severity of the fire, we don't really know, but based on what we do know about these species, it seems quite likely. So just to go into what I mean when I say that it seems likely that interactions with the soil would affect plant community recovery, this is just a photograph of the area in question, partly to give you some context, but partly also to show that a major driver of forest composition and structure in this area and in Australia in general is the depth and composition of the soil. with quite an extreme example in the foreground there. So most of Australia is characterised by these old, weathered and nutrient-poor soils. And this means that even small changes in soil depth and nutrient availability affect what plant communities we get. And it also means that a lot of Australia's plant species have some form of specialist adaptation for acquiring nutrients. And that includes the ability to form reciprocally beneficial or mutualistic interactions with symbiotic soil microbes. So plant species trade carbon from the atmosphere for nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil. And these two figures are taken from community vegetation surveys just east of the area that I showed. And you can see that the majority of plant species there do form some form of mutualism with soil microbes. And although a lot of those are relatively common opuscular mycorrhizal fungal interactions, a variety of other mutualisms are present. And species that form ectomycorrhizal and rhizobial mutualisms actually account for the majority of the canopy cover in those areas, so the eucalyptus and the acacias. So wildfire quite obviously affects the above ground plant communities. We can see those effects, and we can see that with increasing severity wildfires, those effects are increasingly severe. But it also seems like these really intense wildfires are having increasingly severe effects on microbial biomass composition, as well as soil depth via composition and changing abiotic soil properties. And we know that all of those things are interdependent. So abiotic conditions like soil depth, the availability of light, water, and nutrients, temperature and pH all affect plant and microbial community composition directly, but also indirectly by modulating the interactions between the two sets of communities. For example, the way in which they trade those carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And we also know that fire, and especially these really intense fires, have huge impacts on those abiotic conditions and on the plant and soil communities. So plant and soil communities are lost through combustion, with even fire-adapted organisms being lost under these really high severity fires. And that then has at least two potential effects on their interactions. So first, just through losing those organisms, we're losing a large number of those interactions. And then secondly, those interactions that are retained are likely to change because the abiotic conditions that drive them have changed. So the relative costs and benefits of any mutualism have shifted. I won't go into detail here, but in general, the combination of changes to partner availability and abiotic conditions under which those partners are interacting is generally predicted to result in one of several potential outcomes. And that can include the loss of those interactions completely, shifts from mutualism to parasitism, and even ultimately the co-extinction of the partners involved. And we've seen that in other mutualisms, for example, between plant species and bird dispersers or pollinators, but it's a bit of an unknown in terms of plant species and their soil mutualists, particularly in the context of wildfire. And it seems increasingly important that we do understand how these changing interactions are affecting plant and soil biodiversity, because it's not just wildfires we need to worry about, as Richard highlighted earlier. So the cartoon I showed kind of implicitly assumes that our starting point is some kind of equilibrium, but these photos show that, as with most of the world, that's not really the case. So wildfires are following and likely preceding other climate events. And in this case, the fires followed one of the worst droughts New South Wales has seen. So these trees here haven't been scorched by fire, but rather they've been affected by drought. So just to finish relating back to some of the questions we were asked to address, my research is looking at how wildfires might affect these mutualistic interactions between plant species and soil microbes, and how that might indirectly affect biodiversity both now and in the long term. And this does seem to be a bit of a gap in our understanding of the effects of wildfires. So this is just a case study from Australia, but many of the plant communities that are experiencing these intense wildfires, as we just saw, also relied on mutualisms. For example, some of the forests in Americas, Europe, and Russia, as well as global heathlands. And that has potential implications for land use and conservation policy. So the very preliminary work that we're doing here came about because of huge investment by the Australian government to fund basic research into the ecology of these rare and endemic species that are being threatened by these really severe wildfires. And of course, if we do have parts of the landscape with particularly fragile soils, the question is whether it's appropriate to manage those landscapes in the same way. And finish that just in time, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lizzie. We're going to move straight on to the next talk. As we said before, there's going to be an opportunity for all the audience to ask questions of all our speakers, but we just want to present all the different presentations first. And we're now going to move to Marie-Charlotte Nilsson, who's going to talk, I think, predominantly about boreal forests. So we're moving to a completely different system. So Marie-Charlotte.
So now, maybe you can see this. So let me see how this works. Okay. Yeah, so I will begin highlighting that there are big differences between continents in fire dynamics and fire strategy that is important to consider when we want to assess the impacts on fire and predicted changes in fire regimes as a consequence of climate warming across the boreal zone. And Brendan Rogers and co-authors has a nice paper describing this. And in short, this involves that North American forests support high intensity crown fires, whereas in Eurasia, low intensity ground fires are more common and historically have been so. And these ground fires in Eurasia are typically not stand replacing and do not kill the overstory trees because the dominant trees have evolved traits to resist and suppress crown fires. So from studies of natural fire chronosequences of forests of Northern Europe, we would expect that pine trees survive the fires and can drop their seeds on sites and establish quickly. And depending on the burn depth of the forest floor, fast growing and more light demanding species may establish from seeds, resulting in increased plant diversity. We also know that ground fires can have direct effects on soil biota depending on heat penetration and burn depth of the organic layer. And fire can also be indirect, modifying soil characteristics and inducing shifts in plant communities, which in turn determines the composition of mycorrhizal fungi, for example, as many of them may be host specific. We would also expect recovery to be a very slow process, with some biota returning a couple of decades later as the vegetation recovers. In 2014 and 2018, Sweden was affected by two major fires that burned vast areas of production forests, and many trees were killed from crown fire. So we became interested in better understanding whether and how the effect of these recent fires will differ from the effects of fire on natural forests. So in stands with varying degrees of fire severity, we are studying how a range of biological communities above and below ground respond to crown fire and ground fire severity. And one question of particular interest is, what role do soil fungi play for ecosystem recovery after fire? So boreal forest soils are fungal dominated. They are rich in decomposer and ectomycorrhizal fungi, and many of the fungi live in symbiosis with trees. And 2 years after the fire, we found that fire strongly reduced ectomycorrhizal fungal biomass, and that live pines appear having a key role in maintaining mycorrhizal fungal biomass, diversity, and community composition. And these fungi were more or less absent from stands of high crown fire severity, where all the trees have died, supporting the view that live trees can be an active sink of carbon to soil microbes. We would, of course, need longer-term data to fully understand the successional trends below ground in response to fire diversity. Fire severity, sorry. In a greenhouse study, we were able to demonstrate that recolonization by conifers, particularly so for the late successional Norway spruce, is favored by soil biota that occur in soils of low fire severity stands with alive pine trees, while the recolonization of the early successional birch appears mainly to be driven by soil abiotic factors caused by the fire. We are also interested in research aimed at understanding how fire severity interacts with disturbances that may occur post-fire, such as salvage logging and restoration or reforestation approaches. So if Sweden and Northern Europe will continue to be more affected by crown fires, research on fire impacts of soils and soil biodiversity will certainly be useful for developing policy documents, informing on what can be done if we want to preserve soils and soil biodiversity, or how different practical approaches will lead to a new generation of trees, soil fertility, and long-term ecosystem productivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie, Charlotte. We're now going to move on to our final speaker, and that's Konstantin, who's going to be telling us about some work he's been doing on soil biodiversity and carbon cycling across Russian forests. So over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I would like to introduce you some results which we obtained in a large-scale project across European Russia, where we focused at the carbon cycling in soil food webs. This territory proposes a nice opportunity to study both geographical gradient and effects of fire, since the year 2010 was very extensive in forest fires, so we were able to compare fires of the same age. So we choose the transect from the White Sea to the Black Sea, taking into account three groups of the boreal forests: northern taiga, central taiga, and southern taiga close to Moscow, and broad-leaved forests on Chernozem soils and the Mediterranean forests close to the Black Sea. In each of these zones, we took 4 burnt areas and 4 respective controls with a similar vegetation, and took some samples in replication of 5 plots. So the more detail you will be able to find in the reference provided here, but in general we tried to focus on several parameters of ecosystems, including soil parameters like pH, climate variables, and also landscape variables. But our major aim was to see the properties of soil food webs. So we took both structural and functional parameters of the food webs, like CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. And as well, we studied the biomass of different components of the soil food web, like fungal bacterial biomass by PLFA, and T-state amoebae, nematodes, enchytrids, mites, collembola, and macrofauna. Let's also, because the idea was to see the difference in response of the soil food web to the carbon dynamics, we also assessed carbon content in the different states of the ecosystem as deadwood and litter composition. And using the model by Helen Hunt, which was updated by Francisca de Vries with colleagues later on, we assessed the flows of carbon through the detrital food web in each of these ecosystems. First of all, I would like to say that our results mainly supported the observations made by previous researchers. So the geographical gradient from the north to the south is very obvious. We see that the accumulation of carbon is mainly in the soils of Chernozem zone and Mediterranean, but also we can see that these ecosystems host the majority of both biodiversity and biomass of soil biota. You can see here that in temperate forests there is an enormous amount of earthworm biomass, as well as the biomass of the rest of macrofauna. But along with the geographical changes along this transect, we can say that there was almost no changes in the carbon stocks in almost all parameters of the ecosystem. First of all, it is already 5 years since fire, but it is only dead wood in form of branches and debris, which was significantly higher on the burnt plots. But the only group of soil organisms that significantly decreased after fires were T-state amoebae. And also in some in some plots, we observed the ratio of bacteria to fungi increasing. So at some forest types, fungi were really suppressed. So along with this, we can say that if we come to these burnt areas 5 years after fire, we may not really see the differences in the biomass. But there were also almost no functional changes if we measured carbon flow in the form of CO2 and methane. I don't show this graph, but when we looked at the dynamics of carbon flow through the ecosystem, we saw a very different geographical pattern. Boreal forests and forests in the south of this transect, the broad-leaved forest and the Mediterranean forest, they reacted a bit differently, and I show here only the southernmost diagram. What we can really see that the importance of the fungal channel significantly decreased, while some consumers of fungal biomass also decreased, as you can see here along these arrows. But some organisms were close to significant, like enkitreates, probably benefited from burning of the forest. So to conclude with this, I would like to say that still it is not obvious for a researcher or for observer, if you come to this area and just see the biomass of different components of the food web, you may not really see the difference between burned and unburned plots. But if you look closer into this ecosystem, you may see that all ecosystem is restructured, and the processes supporting this picture are probably different in burned and unburned plots. So what is one of the gaps which we cannot really see in this study, and which really deserves further work, is that we may not distinguish between resistance and resilience of these ecosystems. So we don't really know if it was a recovery or they not really were suppressed. And finally, to address some policymakers, I may really say that if we come to an ecosystem which was burned some years ago, it is always important to know what are the underlying processes occurring now. And we will not really be able to say, was it really recovering or was it resilient to burning? So to judge only on the comparison of the biomass or standing trees or number of earthworms is not always relevant to the real picture which can be found in the real nature, in the ecosystems which we observe. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Konstantin. And thank you very much to all the speakers. I think the points, some general points which I've certainly taken from this series of presentations is that you've emphasized the importance of different fire regimes in different systems, but also the importance of other factors like soil conditions, proactive management, things like fire suppression in determining the consequences or potential consequences on soil biota. And I think another theme that's coming out quite strongly, and also in the questions that I'm starting to look at, is questions about post-recovery and the importance of soil organisms within that recovery process. So what we're going to do now is we've opened up to the floor. There's already some questions coming in, but I'd encourage people in the audience to start posting questions. As Diana said, we can't cover all questions, but what we can do is try and bulk some of those questions together if they're on general themes. And if you don't get an answer to the question, hopefully we can potentially cover that through general questioning of the people. I think one thing I'd first like to do is say, if all the speakers panelists could please put their videos on. So thanks very much. I think we've got everyone there. I think one of the things before we just go to questions from different people is that one thing that sort of strikes me is we heard from different systems and we heard about different organisms that are affected. And one thing you all, well, certainly three of you mentioned, was the importance of fungi. And I just wondered if you saw any generalities in fire effects on soil biota, which we can take from these different systems. I mean, are there general patterns, or are they just differ across different systems? And it seemed to me, at least, that you all mentioned fungi, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are other organisms. And I'll start with Konstantin, actually, because you were the most recent speaker, and you talked a lot about these fungal food webs, and then I'll move on to Marie-Charlotte and to Lizzie.
It seems to me, first of all, I may say that I'm soil zoologist. I'm not a specialist in soil microbes, but what we observed across this transect from the north to the south, that fungi are not really similarly affected by fires. So there was some response by decreasing fungal biomass in some ecosystems, while in the others it was not so obvious. For example, in the boreal forest, they were really depressed, and there was increasing bacterial to fungal ratio, while in the Chernozem zone, which is a really thick organic layer with sometimes 1 meter deep organic layer, fungi were not really as much affected by fires. So I think it is also related to the type of ecosystems, not only due to the organisms like fungi or bacteria, if we speak about microorganisms.
Okay, thank you, Marie-Charlotte, I wonder if you had any thoughts on this?
What we've seen, I mean, the boreal forest soils are, I mean, dominated by fungi, so they are super important. And it seems like, I mean, the effect on the trees are very important to support the ectomycorrhizae fungi. But what we had expected was that maybe the decomposer fungi would have sort of taken over and become more dominant when all the ectomycorrhizae, which, as I understand, are looked upon as being more competitive than the decomposer fungi, that they would have taken over this open niche that is there. But probably it's just too short after the fire. So maybe we can see that later on.
Okay. Yeah, and Lizzie, again, you focused on mutualists, predominantly fungal, not entirely fungal, but you did talk a lot about fungi. And again, I wondered whether that was because you felt that they were a predominant group of organisms that were strongly affected, or.
I suppose as a plant ecologist, they were the thing that I focused on in terms of being quite, sort of expected to be quite important in that system. And going back to your point about whether there are any sort of generalities, I suppose a lot of us touched on that because we are thinking about the impacts on the plant communities. So what happens to the soil then affects the plant communities, and we expect those mutualisms to be quite important in a lot of these systems. And I don't know to what, I mean, I'd be interested to know to what extent kind of the diversity of trees that rely on these mutualisms kind of influences how important they are then. So in Australia, sort of, we've got a lot of diversity in terms of the different mutualisms that trees rely on, and maybe that's different in the systems that other people working in. So I don't know, Marie-Charlotte, if that's a bit different in your systems in terms of the trees that rely on those mutualisms and the range of those.
Yeah, I think one of the other sort of, you touched on generalities there, and one of the things I want to come back to later is the role of those organisms in recovery, which was another theme that you touched on. But I'm just looking at the questions now, because I should really shift to what people are asking. And one thing that's cropping up in quite a few questions is about anthropogenic starts of fires as opposed to climate-induced fires. And I just wondered, I mean, there was a question here about forest management. So this is more generally about the actual triggers of fires and causes of fires. And two people in here have pointed to anthropogenic wildfire starts in recent years increasing, combined with the effects of climate change. This is causing larger, high severity fires. And they're asking about what can actually be done to mitigate these anthropogenic starts of fires. And I guess I'll pass over to Mac, if you don't mind asking about that. I've got another question related to this anthropogenic fires that I'll come back to, but perhaps we could start by that, Mac.
Sure. I don't know exactly what the statistics are in any place other than sort of my immediate area, which is in that eastern part of the US, but a great majority of the starts are anthropogenic in our region. So either arson or accidental, if somebody lets a campfire get away from them, or a cigarette butt, or these kinds of things. So it's your so-called natural ignitions are actually pretty rare in our region. And I don't know if that's true for the other places that have been discussed, but most starts are anthropogenic, probably, I would say, in North America. So to mitigate for those, I really don't know what to do. There's a pretty clear relationship between population density and wildfire starts, for example. And so, you know, where there are people, there will be wildfires, I guess is what I would say. And so again, I go back to the notion that in order to mitigate for the eventuality of a wildfire, we have to take proactive steps towards dealing with fuel, right? So reducing fuel loads. And probably, okay, of course, I told you guys at the outset that I'm kind of a fire positive. I take a fire positive attitude. And so I would say that if we know that fires are going to happen, we might as well try to make them happen under conditions in which we can control them a little better, right? So rather than have a wildfire, we should, in cases where it's possible, attempt to have prescribed fires or controlled fires where we're reducing fuels, but we're doing it in such a way that we don't get catastrophic results. Okay. I don't know if that's an adequate answer or not.
No, it's fine. I don't know if anyone else has any views on that. I mean, Lizzie, perhaps you could maybe say a few words about in Australia, what the predominant causes are.
I wouldn't like to comment on what the cause in Australia is. Although I suppose one point I would make there is the differences in anthropogenic management of fire, and how that and how thinking about how there have been changes to those for over really long time periods as well, not just over recent history, can tell us something about sort of biodynamics and what we might expect, how we might expect to see things changing. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, the other related question to that, and this was actually a question from Marie, was about, you were talking about fires across North America and Europe, and also in particularly in Sweden. But the question was, I wonder if you could comment on general patterns in South America, and particularly tropical forests, where fires are almost entirely human caused. You may not be aware of studies in that area, but I just wondered if, I guess the general question is whether the general models that might emerge from other systems will be applicable in tropical systems, or whether we need to have completely different approaches to understanding the impacts on soil biodiversity.
Oh, I should pass on that question. No, I don't have any informed answer on that one. That was an interesting one, but I think, no,
Okay.
I don't
know
dare
if you
to
speakers, because, okay, I mean, Konstantin, I know in your study there were no tropical forests because they weren't present on the gradient, but I guess are people aware of studies in tropical systems compared to other systems?
It's always better to speak about your own data than something which you have heard of or read. But my understanding is that tropical ecosystems are even worse to be even slow to recover as compared to temporal ecosystems, because the tropical forests are even more vulnerable to such disturbances. Unfortunately, I'm not really a specialist in tropical ecosystems as Marie-Charlotte, so no more details I can provide yet.
Okay, thank you. I think that you mentioned there, Konstantin, the other issue that's quite a lot of questions are coming up about, which is post-fire recovery, which quite a lot of you talked about. And I'm going to go back to a point about mutualisms, and I'll ask Lizzie this question first, if you don't mind. But I mean, you talked about impacts on mutualisms, as did other people. But I wondered if you could say a little bit about, well, the question is, what would their role be within the recovery process of those systems post-fire?
I don't actually know, but that's something that I have wondered myself, as thinking it as, you know, something quite important to find out. So one thing that we've seen at our sites is just immediate colonization and dominance by acacias, which sort of form mutualisms with rhizobia. And, you know, to what extent that then affects kind of what's going on with soil biodiversity if you have this, you know, monodominant stand forming these mutualisms. And, you know, just from, this is going a bit off topic now, but from some work that I've done on invasive acacias and looking at the changes they make to the soil community in invasion situations, you know, they're quite strong changes. And so sort of that is one of the things that I, you know, really think that the role of mutualisms is potentially quite important in determining not post-fire recovery, but then also how post-fire recovery kind of, in terms of the above ground vegetation proceeds, then affecting soil biodiversity and those feedbacks between them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Marie-Charlotte, I wondered if you had any thoughts, because again, you were talking about post-fire recovery in these chronosequence studies.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that to predict successional changes above ground in a very species-poor boreal forest is tricky. But then if you think about the below ground system, it's even harder. And actually, I think there is a lot of variation, and there is so many different factors that actually play in here. So, I mean, there is, I think also, depending on the weather system, whether there are seeds available for plants to establish, it could turn the succession in one direction, depending on whether it's super dry and there is no seeds available. And for example, if the size of the fire area is huge, I think it also can be a spatial differences. But for sure, I mean, microbes are necessary to turn around the organic matter that is still left there. And there are some general understanding from using these chronosequences, I would say. But how important the mutualism specifically are, we know it can take a couple of decades for mycorrhizal fungi to come back, but it's a big span.
Okay, well that leads me nicely onto another question that was just posted, and this is, what is the best management after fire? And I appreciate this is probably specific to different systems, but I wondered if anyone could say anything. One of the questions here is, a clear cut the best practice even when trees are alive? Can that foster pest outbreaks? Another question was, can we use things like bio-augmentation? I assume that means adding mycorrhizal fungi. So I wondered if people had views on what you can actually do to accelerate the recovery of fire. And perhaps if we could start with Mac, because if you could maybe talk more generally about the actual management that can be implemented, and then we can move to other people about the role of soil biodiversity in that.
Sure. I think, you know, probably the thing that has to be taken into account, and this is intuitive, I think, probably for everyone on the panel and in the audience, but the actions taken in terms of management are entirely dependent on the severity and intensity of the fire that happened, right? So, and of course, as you said, Richard, it depends on the ecosystem and the specific, sort of the specific setting in which the fire occurred. So I saw in the Q&A pod, I saw some questions about erosion. And so in really severe fires where it's total removal of live above ground biomass and maybe even the entire horizon of the soil where that happens, erosion is a serious issue. And so best management practices, at least in terms of what we do in the Forest Service, we have these burned area emergency response teams, and soil stabilization is the biggest thing, and we do that in various ways. But the biggest, you know, the biggest thing to try to do is to stabilize the soil by, you know, either physical means or biological means. So as you said, the bio-augmentation Trying to get vegetation established as quickly as possible, over as wide an area as possible is probably the best management practice. In less severe cases, where maybe a lot of the above ground biomass is still alive. So let's say the fire occurred in a system where there's fire adapted plants and many of them survive the fire. Best management in that case, I don't have a lot of recommendations in that regard. So a lot of times you would just maybe monitor and see what the fire effects actually were and take active management to shift things in the direction that you have as an objective for your management. So if you notice, as Lizzie pointed out, that you've got an overabundance of an undesirable species following a fire, you might take management approaches to try to remove that plant in sensitive areas or something like this. But it has to be, obviously your management has to be tuned to the objective and the specific event.
Okay. And I guess that one of the specific questions was about bio-augmentation, and I sort of take from that the reference was to adding things like mycorrhizal fungi. And I wondered if any of the other panel members had any thoughts on whether that could be a viable option for accelerating recovery. Perhaps Konstantin, you're moving.
No, really, I don't really have much about bio-augmentation, but first maybe I'll add something to Mac said just now, and it will continue with bio-augmentation. One of the practices, at least here in Russia, especially in the Russian Far East, is if it's a low severity fire and some trees are surviving, there is a clear cutting and removal of these burnt stems. Actually, there is an illegal logging based on that. So they first start small fires such as surface fire, and then officially they can remove burnt forests and export it to China illegally. But my idea is, if you leave these trees untouched, they are some kind of sources for diversity, and for they also provide needles or litter for surrounding area, and branches are falling, and they are all impregnated with propagulas of microbes which are falling down to the soil, and this can be one of the starters for the recovery, because it provides additional litter which is immediately settled by microorganisms. So my idea is that leaving dead wood is essential for the recovery.
Yeah, I don't know if you...
Yeah, I can just fill in and say that what we've seen is that if we will log trees that are dead, there will be no effect on the soil microbes. But if you log alive trees, of course, there will be negative effects on the soil biota. So one way to preserve soil biota is to actually leave the trees that survive the fires. But in Sweden, it's you take everything from the fire area, and that might have also economic and practical reasons. But I think that could be one thing you can do. And another thing you can do is also to let the trees become older, so they actually survive the fire. That's another thing, because I think that this is production forests that burn with crown fires. So maybe also thinking how you can prevent fires from how you manage the forests could be one thing. And also what I think is, I mean, usually you also soil scarify after fire. And I mean, the fire in itself will reduce the ground layer vegetation, which we know are competing with the seedlings. But sometimes I wonder if it's necessary. And I think we are lacking knowledge whether soil scarification is necessary. But it could also be that, I mean, there are also pathogenic fungi coming that are stimulated by the fire. So it could also be, I mean, it's a lot of things you need to consider when you're trying to replant the fire area.
Yeah. One point that was raised in one of the questions, again, sort of related to recovery, and it's not about the biota as much, it's more about the fact that carbon cycling will vary over time. But do we know anything about the interactive effects of things like charcoal on soils and how that might impact on recovery? Because a lot of these forests, well, particularly boreal forests, etc., will have high contents of charcoal. I just wondered if anyone had any perspectives on how that black carbon or charcoal could actually contribute to the recovery process. Konstantin, I know you had to talk about this in your paper on Russia.
Not much about the charcoal itself, but maybe Marie-Charlotte would like to add, because there was a studies by David Wardle about the role of charcoal in long-term perspective. Maybe you will add that. But what I have seen in many of the ecosystems which we studied, it was no so much change in the properties of the soils, except for some physical and chemical. Let's say for soil animals, it's not that important that they walk on the charcoal or they walk on the sand, which is not a food for them, both of them. Let's say it's for soil animals, I think it's more like a mineral part of the soil rather than some additional disturbing agent, for, let's say. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you had any additions to that, Marie-Charlotte, because I know that obviously you know David and the work that David's been doing there and yourself on charcoal. I just wondered to what extent that could be involved in the recovery process.
Yeah, I think from the work we have done that the deposition of charcoal on the ground could have a rejuvenating effect on soil microbes, and also facilitate some of the fast-growing tree species. But also it could absorb some of the phenolic compounds that are deposited as litter, which also facilitates microbial activity. Mm-hmm. But this effect might not be long lasting. It might be the first 10, 20 years or so. But definitely there are large amounts of charcoal that are deposited. And to me, at least, I think that is an important part of the fire and the positive effect we can see on plant diversity.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to change the. Sorry, Mac. Yeah, you had
just a little bit more about black carbon. Or charcoal, char and soot. I don't know about recovery, but I do know that from long-term prescribed fire studies that we have going in fire, frequent fire forests here in the southeastern U.S., that char certainly has a strong impact on soil carbon dynamics, right? So over the long term, under a frequent fire regime, we actually are seeing evidence of increased carbon storage in those systems. In spite of the losses to CO2 in the actual combustion events. So it's a little bit counterintuitive that the more often you burn, the more carbon you store. But those are results that are coming out from our group, hopefully in the near future. So keep your eyes peeled for those.
Okay. Yeah, I want to move on just a little bit to another topic where we are running out of time a bit. I mean, the main focus of this webinar is on soil biodiversity. Now, I appreciate not all of you focus on soil biodiversity, but there is a question by Johannes Kohler here, which I think is a good question, in that he raises a question: would you agree? I'm going to ask all of you this. Would you agree when I say highly diverse ecosystems, both soil diversity and plant diversity and invertebrate diversity, are more resilient to fires, supporting the demand for action, regenerating, functioning ecosystems, and not just planting monocultures. And I'm going to ask all of you that question, and you can answer it with respect to plant diversity or soil biodiversity. And I guess the key question is, does diversity of plants and soil organisms, which are obviously interrelated, actually confer resilience in any way to fire? And I'll go in the order that we did the presentation. So I'll start with Mac, and then I'll to Lizzie, Marie-Charlotte, and Konstantin.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say that's the short answer. And again, we specialize mainly in prescribed fire, as you probably have figured out by now. But we've done several studies, long-term studies, 20, 30, 50-year-long studies of prescribed fire, and looked at soil microbial diversity and soil invertebrate diversity, and basically find that there is no strong impact of fire on those pools of diversity. And so what it argues for is a mosaic of burned and unburned patches on the landscape, which probably mimics what was happening pre-human impact in North America. Again, all of this is North America. But the southeastern US is a reservoir of biodiversity, both in terms of soil biodiversity and plant and animal diversity. So okay. I think the answer is yes.
Thank you. Lizzie, from your perspective in Australia and as a plant ecologist.
Well, I agree. I'd say the answer is yes. In general, diverse ecosystems tend to be more resilient. I actually read that slightly differently and thought it was asking about whether ecosystems that are already diverse are more resilient to fire. And in general, I suppose that goes back to the idea of looking for generalities and that we kind of don't know much about the differences among systems in terms of their resilience, and whether there'd be differences depending on location in terms of resilience to fire. I think that would be something quite interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Marie-Charlotte?
Yeah, I would also say yes. And I would like to add the structural diversity as well, that we let trees become old, that pine trees become old. And also, in contrast, even age monocultures would be more prone, and younger monoculture will be more prone to fire. But I also think that fire exclusion has been a problem, because Sweden has had very long time with fire exclusion. So frequent burning, where each fire consumes less organic matter, is also important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and finally to Konstantin.
Mm-hmm. I would respectfully disagree with my panelist fellows. My idea is that maybe I just highlight another aspect of this question, but I think that biodiversity is not affecting the resilience of the soil ecosystem to fire. Let's say if we look at most northern ecosystems where we have very low biodiversity and only few species of collembolans and spiders there are, it is, let's say, not so much difficulty for them to get back to this burnt area and to restore this low diversity. But if we speak about subtropical or Mediterranean ecosystems, which are very highly diverse, let's say to get back to this enormous diversity, it may require lots of time, efforts, and parameters of ecosystems to restore. So I may not really say that it's not yes, neither no for this, but it's not that obvious for me if we look if we look only at soil biodiversity. Of course, if ecosystem is supporting a lot of above ground plant species and high plant diversity, it is probably another possibility for ecosystems to restore faster. but not only soil biodiversity in this context will be supporting the recovery of the ecosystem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I guess a sort of a question that's sort of related to that is when we're considering impacts on soil biota and the functions they perform, I guess the chance is that they're likely compounded strongly by other disturbances, such as logging we've heard about, etc. And that could actually exaggerate or increase the impacts. And I just wondered if any of you had any perspectives on how these interactions between disturbances and wildfire could actually exaggerate or exacerbate, if you like, the effects on soil biodiversity. And again, I'll see if I could start with you, Konstantin, because I know again you've worked on this gradient, which I guess
maybe I will introduce you another example, which is not really from this gradient, but it is a very nice picture, but not nice situation around the Chernobyl atomic power plant accident, where there was exclusion of many groups of soil animals due high radiation, and there is accumulation of thick amounts of litter due to exclusion of saprophages. So there is a lot of litter accumulated in the forests around the power plant due to high radiation level, and this is why it is more prone to the forest fires. This is one of the problems now around the Chernobyl, that they are very much endangered of light ignition of this highly radioactive litter. So combining these effects is really bringing us to the idea that exclusion of large saprophages stops the cycling, and it is probably more possible to fires to start here. And of course, this interaction is very important with all other types of anthropogenic activities. Maybe my colleagues will tell about that.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if any of the other panelists have perspectives on that from their systems. So it's really looking at the sort of the interactive disturbances that likely will have the biggest impact on soil organisms. So perhaps Marie, Charlotte?
No, it's an interesting question. We do have some research underway, but I'm not so sure that we will find these interactive effects. Maybe if the interaction between fire severity and other factors, I think, would be important depending on how the overstory trees are impacted. But what I can see from some of the preliminary data, it's not clear cut, actually. So we are doing, putting up some OTCs, open top chambers, to increase warming as well. But we'll see. I think it's more important how recolonization of plants come into the fire sites. That's my feeling now.
Okay, I don't know if the other panelists had anything they wanted to add to that, Lizzie or Mac? No, I guess that does, leading on from that point though, is a question I did have for Lizzie, which relates to some of the questions that are coming through about recolonization. And it's whether, I mean, from a sort of plant ecology perspective, whether there are particular plants or characteristics, traits of plants that you think would be especially effective in sort of increasing colonization, or particular plants that will colonize post-fire that may have beneficial effects on soil organisms. I wondered if you could just say a little bit on.
But again, that sort of partly underpins what motivated the work that we started, is that the whole area, this particular area, burnt. So in terms of sources of colonization, there are none, which is sort of what led to the research. And just having looked at what people have done suggests that cedars are more likely to be able to kind of persist through these really intense fires. But in terms of maintaining those mutualisms, sort of part of the thing that underpins that is these resprouters that are able to persist through these kind of periods of disturbance. But if we're having these really intense fires, then we're losing those resprouting species. So I mean, I guess and I suppose it's not just the colonization of the plants either; it's the colonization of the microbes. And if and if we don't have any sources for that, if we're having these fires over these really large areas at these really high intensities, then I guess that sort of starts to affect the sort of recovery dynamics in terms of what can colonize after fire. Yeah.
I mean, do you, I mean, again, this is open to the whole panel, really. I mean, one of the questions that's come up from Carlo Giancomini, I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, but he's asked a question which is really about improving colonization. And again, this is recolonization. It's a question that's sort of coming through from several people, is really what can be done to recover these habitats. And Carlo's question, he's related to summer wildfires in Sardinia, which affected 25,000 hectares of the island. He said, is it advisable to throw dung and seed bombs, maybe mixed with unburned litter from nearby areas to improve recolonization? I don't know if anyone has any, is prepared to respond to that. Mac, you're smiling. I mean, what can be done to help recolonization of these kind of habitats that have suffered these extreme fires, extensive fires?
Yeah, it's clear that active management is required, I guess I would say. So I don't know what I don't know about the specific technique that was mentioned in the question, but yeah, I think this is an area that is ripe for experimentation, I guess is the best answer. And if you can find something that works, then, and you have an objective, which usually is to revegetate, then whatever works is advisable.
Yeah.
So,
but revegetation is pretty key.
Yeah, I think so. In terms of soil, in terms of maintaining the soil resource as best as possible, revegetation is pretty clearly an early objective that should be met. Yeah.
Lizzie?
So I wondered a bit about that in terms of revegetating and the extent to which, somewhere like Australia, where we've got these really shallow nutrient poor soils, revegetating works if you've lost kind of the soil function. I mean, there hasn't really been any work done on that in Australia, at least, but there has been a lot of work looking at post restoration post mining. So where you have these completely bare soils and looking at that, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend. I'm not sure that we know much about the use of soil in terms of stimulating that revegetation, but there is that research going on in the looking at recovery from mining. I think that there's potentially some things to be learned from there.
Okay, and I guess that also sort of leads to another topic which is being questioned, and someone I can't find the question right now, but it relates to a more practical aspect of how you actually study post-fire effects and recovery. I know some of you have used chronosequences and comparing unburned and burned areas, but the question is really, if fires events are so unpredictable and difficult to actually predict where they're going to occur, how do you actually go about studying effects of fire on ecosystems and have a valid pre-fire control? This is a question from one of the panelists who was clearly wanted to know about how you actually go about doing this. I mean, again, I know Marie-Charlotte and Konstantin, you've both done some of this work, so perhaps you could just respond to that question, Marie-Charlotte.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, ideally, you would do all your investigation before the fire, and then you can come back after the fire. But what we have done in this 2014 fire, it was a large area that was affected, was that we put up some basic criteria of that the forest should have been of a certain age and a certain soil type and a certain age, etc. And then we went out and actually characterized the effect of fire and could distinguish them into different fire severity classes. And then we also had some nearby stands that were unaffected by the fire. And because these are production forests, I mean, the landowners, they have good records of, I mean, the management history and that how they actually had thinned the forest before. So the data, the historical data of each stand was rather good. And we also tried to reconstruct the fire areas with that of the unburnt forest, and we could see that, I mean, it's rather similar, as good as you actually can get it. And then you also, I think it would be important is to have as many replicates as possible, and also have a spatial, you know, spread them out spatially so they are not all stands or in one corner of the fire area, just to make sure that you don't have autocorrelation among the stands.
Yeah, thank you. And Konstantin, I know in your study you had burned and unburned controls, but I guess, but how confident are you that the unburned control really did reflect the burnt area?
You know, we faced this problem that we were not able to distinguish between resistance and resilience if we didn't work on the same plot, let's say. But there are some studies which mainly focus on soil animals, that there are artificial burnings when you can come to a plot, study and record everything and then artificially burn it, but it's not always possible. And if you work with soil animals, which are quite small sometimes, it is possible also to do a laboratory study. We did it a couple of times. Once we did it in Uppsala in the cooperation with Trygve Persson and Janne Bengtsson in SLU. We just brought soil samples to the lab and burned them artificially. It is possible to see what happens to soil animals, but not with the whole ecosystem, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that actually leads to a question that's just been posted actually, as just before you were speaking. And it says, has anyone performed synthetic experiments to look at the effects of fire on soil, carbon, nutrients and biodiversity? And I'd add to that, if you have, do you think they can inform anything about impacts of fire in natural systems? Lizzie.
So I haven't, but I do know people have in Australia. So people have looked at, I've read a paper recently, they've constructed kind of mesocosms and applied burning to them. And in general, people are quite keen to do that sort of thing, I've discovered. But I suppose an issue is understanding what happens with these really high severity fires, because it's really hard to recreate those high severity fires. And those are the ones that I guess seem to be causing the biggest changes in terms of, or the biggest disruptions to those systems. And it's difficult to study those because severity is correlated with so many other environmental variables. It's really difficult to have that control. So in the photographs that I showed earlier, you can see that obviously fire severity and things like that is going to be really strongly related to the vegetation that's there, topography and things like that. So fire frequency is one thing that you can do, or time since fire, but thinking about how you can get at the effects of fire severity and get really reasonable controls is quite tricky. I suppose the one thing you can do though is with increasing advances in modelling, fire predictive modelling. So there is opportunities to sort of go out and sample in areas predicted to be at high risk from fire before the fire season. And I suppose that's one advantage of studying soil biodiversity, is it's quite easy to take some soil samples.
Okay, Marie, I mean, your work is predominantly for you was based on chronosequence, but also I think you have some glasshouse studies, etc. So I just wondered if you could say about the value of these more synthetic experiments for understanding fire effects on biodiversity.
I think they can answer questions that you can't answer from doing fieldwork or field observations. So I think they are complementary. For example, we collected soils and we sterilized them and we re-inoculated the soils with soil biota, etc. So it can answer questions that you can't do in the field if you want to test a specific question. But of course, I mean, you have no live mycorrhizal from the trees because you can't put the big trees in these small pots. So, but I think that if you do field work and then you can do the mesocost studies in parallel, I think that can be very informative.
Mm-hmm. And Mac, I mean, you work predominantly from an above ground perspective, but and also on soils in general. Is this the kind of approach that you've tried to use at all?
Yeah, certainly. I would echo what the others have said, in that you can explore mechanisms perhaps in the more synthetic environment where you create a fuel bed that's 2 meters by 2 meters and set it on fire and see what happens. We've done that with our char production studies, recent char production studies. But again, I think extrapolating to scale from those kinds of experiments can be it inspires caution, certainly. And so probably the best way, and the U.S. Forest Service actually has an effort underway right now to essentially do a full instrumentation and measurement of an area and then intentionally start a fire that would mimic wildfire conditions. And I think anything short of that is going to be somewhat difficult to really extrapolate to the wildfire scenario.
Okay.
So the work's underway. It's difficult to get approval to do. When you tell the authorities you're about to start a wildfire, they usually don't like that very much. But we finally got it. Hopefully we'll have it going soon. So.
So don't do this at home. Make sure you get a proper
Correct.
risk assessment. Yeah, one other point, I'm aware that we haven't got too much longer later, but we talked a lot about impacts of fire and other disturbances on the soil system, but another potential indirect effect on livelihoods and on ecosystems is smoke generation and aerosols resulting from this. And I know this is a topic that is quite prominent at the moment in the United States and other parts of the world because of the extensive fires and the smoke that results. And what kind of impacts will that have on other ecosystems? And again, I'll go to you, Mac, because I think being in the US, you might have.
Yeah, smoke is certainly a big issue, and it has human health impacts and consequences. And so, again, in the sort of scenario that we have envisioned, which is that fires are inevitable, they are going to happen. If you have fuel buildup and you've got ignition sources, either natural or human, there will be fires. And so, the management of smoke is another component that we've got to take into consideration. And so you can either produce smoke intentionally at a time when you can deal with it and maybe dilute the impact of the smoke using prescribed fire, for example, so that we can, it's kind of the question of, do you want to pay me now or do you want to pay me later? So I think that smoke management is another aspect of prescribed fire that may be becoming more and more attractive to managers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and does any of the other panel members have any thoughts on it, rather than putting any of you on the spot? Because I realize it's quite different from the areas that you're topping. So if anyone had any other comments on that, Konstantin?
Maybe I can add, since I'm an entomologist by my background, I studied a bit soil-living caribids and some other beetles, and there are really dependent on smoke species which are so-called pyrophilous. These species are adapted to arrive to freshly burned areas and colonize them, and they live usually on these areas for 2 or 3 or up to 5 years, and then they are pushed out by competition with another species arriving. So these species of beetles, they have perfect smoke detectors, so they can arrive to the freshly burned area in just minutes after ignition. So this is one of the signals for the pyrophilous species to arrive. So the smoke itself is not really affecting their, I don't know, life in the burned area, but it is a detection for them to come to breed extremely fast to colonize this area.
Mac, I think was going to
Hey,
contribute.
may I ask a question, Kostya? Is there seasonality to the life cycle of those beetles? So if you were, say, for example, to burn an area in a different season, would that impact their?
No, I think all the season they are active. It is mainly temperate ecosystems. All the time when they are active, they are just ready to arrive. So it's a question for survival for them. So if they don't arrive, they cannot breed in this area, and they lost their chance. Yeah.
So someone in the chat's actually just pointed out, which you'll be able to see, they're doing work on impacts of wildfire smoke on orangutans in Indonesia, and they've given a link to that paper. So clearly people are looking at smoke impacts on other organisms, and it's good to hear that there's also work on soil organisms as well. I'm aware that we're running very short of time, and I've probably only got time for one more question. And there's one that's been put forward by Katie Lambert some time ago. And this was actually a question directed at Mac, but I'm going to ask all of you because it really relates to one of the things that we challenged with you with asking. And I'm going to modify the question a little bit, so I apologize to Katie, but basically her question was, as a new soil scientist in the US trying to establish a research topic, what would you say is a topic pertaining to soil and wildfire that is highly overlooked but very important? So I just asked that sort of generally to all of you, and we'll go through the order that you gave your presentations about what would you say was the topic in soil and soil biodiversity and wildfire that is highly overlooked but very important. So if we start with Mac, we're putting you on the spot first, but the question was to you, Mac. So then we'll move on to Lizzie.
Sure. I mean, I think it's the same question that is important in all management systems, which is how are microbial populations being affected? How are the functions of those populations being affected? And how does that, how do those changes, if any, cascade through the food web and their functions? I mean, I think it's a wide open area of study, and yeah, I would encourage everybody to start.
Okay, thanks, Lizzie.
I just echo what Mac said. I think in general, soil is overlooked. Yeah, in general, and particularly thinking about how kind of fire management regimes might affect the soil. And then, yeah, how those changes cascade through. So if you're thinking about, restoring plant communities or any communities, then thinking about how the soil affects that.
Thank you. Marie-Charlotte?
Yeah, the first thing I wrote down here was functions. And I mean, it would be, first of all, I mean, we need to know who they are and what their role are. What are the functions? I think that would be important to also sort of predict what's going to happen if fire severity or change in the future, and how we should manage the system.
Thank you. And finally, Konstantin.
Yeah. My personal idea is to distinguish between resistance and resilience, which is still irritated me. We cannot address really, and it requires special conditions. But also, I think we didn't discuss it much. But the question of size of the burned area is not really addressed for soil organisms, because usually soil organisms live on very small patches, and it's enough for them to have a couple of leaves to survive. Are they really affected by the size of the area, or they can live on these small patches which are remained after fires? And of course, I agree with my colleagues that what we need to see is the functions of the whole food web, which is remaining after fire. It is not yet addressed in different geographical conditions. It is studied somewhere, but it's really a patchy picture. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we've probably got about 30 seconds left. So I'd firstly just like to thank all the panelists for an inspiring conversation about different aspects of wildfire. And I'd also like to thank the audience for your questions, which have kept me occupied. And I apologize if I haven't asked all of them, but I tried to amalgamate different questions from different people. I guess the last thing to say is that these talks will be posted up at some point on YouTube, and thank you very much to everyone for attending. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.